we had a good season of fast and prayer and a good season of breakfast as well. So we're grateful for that. I hope you all did as well. When Jeremy opened fast and prayer this morning, he mentioned the Song of Zion 203. What was the name of it again?
To See a Better Day.
To See a Better Day. Kind of ties into maybe a thought that I've had this week that we can kind of expand upon today, too, as a matter of fact. Seeing a better day. I mean, I think we all have those opportunities in life. You know, some days, just great. No problems. We thank the Lord for everything that goes on. And then some days, we just want to maybe stay in bed and forget about it all because, things aren't that good. It's a matter of what we see in life. Some days there's joy and some days there's peace and success, and then other days, come along and we feel defeated and we see disappointment in our life and sometimes tragedy and a lot of unhappiness that goes on. It's a matter of that's life, I guess, in what our situations. And it's not so much, I think, we got to concern ourselves about what happens to us, but how do we see what happens to us? How do we react to those conditions of life that we all have on any given day? And I think what happens with that is it's a term called perspective. It's how we see things. The definition of perspective says it's a particular way of viewing, understanding, or interpreting a situation. Perspective of life. When we get up in the morning, things are going to happen. And we've got to take a look at how we deal with what we see in our life as much as what happens to us in those particular events and all that. You could look at the same situation. People can, you and I can look at it, the same situation, and walk away with two different interpretations of what we see. A classic example of that is that there were two shoe salesmen. One of them was out there, and they were in this remote wilderness town, and the one fellow was out there knocking on doors and trying to sell shoes to people. And everybody that he would meet would tell him, we don't need shoes. We don't wear shoes. So that's not going to work for us. And he stopped selling. He was meeting another shoe salesman for lunch. And the other guy that was just coming into the scene asked him, well, how's it going out there? He says, it's terrible. He says, nobody here wears shoes or they want to wear shoes. That was one perspective. The second salesman says, that's a great opportunity. Nobody wears shoes. Let's think of all the possibilities there are to sell them shoes. Same situation, two perspectives on what that situation is. And we have that every day in our life. We have situations, and we have one way to look at it, and then we have perhaps another way to look at it, a godly way to look at it. That's the direction I'm trying to go in this situation here. That the influences that we have in life need to be influenced by God in our life. The recognition and the understanding that He is there every day, active and alive. And we'll find that out a little bit later on today as we hear testimonies. Testimonies of the perspective of God in your life, no matter what kind of a situation you have. Blessings, if you will, or some kind of tragedy or some kind of event that kind of will bring us down. There's two perspectives on how we handle those situations in our life. It was a Friday back in Jerusalem many years ago, right, where Jesus himself was condemned to death. And we know that on that Friday, they crucified him. And it was a pretty dark day for the world. And although it was predicted, 3 days later, they went to that empty tomb and they saw that he wasn't there anymore, that he was gone. And it gave us the hope that we have today, that Jesus is alive in our life, a perspective. On Friday, it was a very somber situation. On Sunday, we look at it and we see the hope that's there because the perspective of what we know that happened at that point in time to this day is there for us to be able to enjoy and all that. in Numbers, we're told that Moses was instructed to go to the land of Canaan. And before he did that, he sent some spies out to go and survey the land, see what you see. I think there was 10 spies? Or 12 spies. 10 of them came back after they saw the land full of giants in a lot of trouble. They didn't see the projection of the land of milk and honey that God had presented them. But 2, Joshua and Caleb, looked at the exact same situation. Their perspective of that situation was, you know what, we got to take the land. It says here, let's go up at once and possess it, for we are well to overcome it. Like those shoe salesmen. 2 perspectives of the same situation. Like our lives, bad things happen to us in our life. And we could kind of give up and give in and feel depressed and demoted in whatever. Or we can, with the energy and spirit that God puts within our hearts, we can look at that same situation with hope, not despair. That we can look at it with a promise of what God might be doing for us in that situation. The difference with these spies is not what they saw with their eyes, it's what they saw in their faith, in their spirit. And then, we have that opportunity as well. We get recharged on Sunday mornings to hopefully energize our spirit and maybe to enlighten our minds and our eyes in terms of what we might see physically, maybe improved with our spirit, our spiritual eyesight, to see what God is really doing in our life as a result of the situation here. Now, the question is, what do we do with the problems? Is our focus on the problems of life, or is our focus on the situation and God's power and God's ability to get us through any circumstances of trouble that we might have in our life? It's back to us again. And we get energized on a Sunday morning, perhaps, with the perspective that it's been a weary week. It's been trying and troublesome. And at best, I just wanted to kind of end at this point in time. So we come to church on Sunday morning, we have fast and prayer, we have a nice fellowship breakfast, we have an opportunity to hear a message and see our testimonies and get re-energized for the week to come to change our perspective on what is happening in our life and how we can respond to things and what goes on. The focus is what is it, the problem that we focus on, or is it God's power that we focus on to be able to get through these days that challenges us in very, very many ways? It's life. So it's a matter of how do we look at life? Do we look at life with fear, or do we look at life with faith? Simple choice that we each got to make. And we have that opportunity, maybe based upon how the Lord has gotten us through our lives in the past. I kind of grew up spiritually in the Anaheim branch years ago before there was an Irvine. And I didn't come from the church. I came from the outside. And so a lot of what I experienced in life was from these older brothers and sisters that, some of them actually lived through the Holocaust. In the persecution and the horrendous time that befell the Jewish people in the 1940s and so on. A couple of these brothers and sisters, could only speak Italian, not really speak too good of English, and they would get up every Sunday morning in the simplest form and talk about life and how they were able to kind of get through some very difficult time. And sometimes I think that my life is difficult, and you might be thinking the same thing. But some of these older brothers and sisters, their testimonies rang true in terms of their perspective of life through God's eyes. They were simple people, and I don't mention that in a bad way. They were not complex as we are today. We get busy, we get involved, we got stuff. We got deadlines, and we've got appointments, and we've got achievements we got to deal with. And these brothers and sisters, they just dealt with trying to exist in life. I couldn't even fathom some of the things that they had to live through, but yet they bore a vision of their testimony in terms of their perception of what they were going to go through. And when I look at it today, times have changed for us. We live in a more sophisticated society with information everywhere and, actually too much stuff. that we can lose sight of the fact that God's trying to get our attention to look at life through His eyes, to see life from His perspective and not necessarily what we think we know and what we're trying to figure out based on our own experiences. What I'm suggesting is I think we need to simplify our life as much as we can in the day and age that we still are expected to be overachievers, I guess, and accomplish things in all different sizes and ways. We've got to kind of look at faith does not deny the reality of life is. Our faith sees God's hand in the reality of what we live. That's a perspective. We don't see the reality of life in a negative way, but we see the reality of life in the fact that with God, He can do all things in our life. And the faith that we have. Again, I look at this screen and I look at just the health challenges that many of you had in that situation and how you've endured that. And your perspective of life today, I have to say, is probably pretty confident in the Lord, not in yourselves. Because, you've gotten through some really big challenges in your life to be able to testify like those older brothers and sisters did in the Anaheim Ranch to me. That says, okay, my perspective of life is not dismal, even though the things that I had to go through have been dismal and disappointing. But I saw through them. My faith, my faithful perception of life through God's eyes says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And that's what I'm trying to say today. We need to kind of get re-energized in that situation. That doesn't change the circumstances we go through. We will have health challenges. We will have financial problems. Our relationships sometimes may be strained in that situation. But, with having a spiritual perception on things, it changes to having the ability to cope with the situation because you're not alone in dealing with it. That's a message that we can kind of get reaffirmed on Sunday morning again, that I am not alone in whatever's going to happen this week, the challenge that I have, whether it be in business or my family or my health or the world. Good Lord, we know that we can't do a single thing to improve the condition of this world and the people that are in power, if you will. Good Lord, we have to depend upon God and His ability to get us through it all in some way, shape, or form. Again, we could get defeated, we could get depressed, we could give up if we will, but we can't do that because, it's in God that we have our trust and our faith. And we look back at it again in terms of our life and we say, thank God He's been with me through these situations in life. That's our perception that we need to kind of put in our life every day. Apostle Paul, he was imprisoned, he was beaten, he was persecuted, and yet he wrote here to the Corinthians. He said, "For our light afflictions worketh for us a more exceeding and eternal weight of glory." He recognizes that our light afflictions, well, some of our afflictions are not very light sometimes. They're very heavy. But Paul here, in spite of all the suffering that he went through, he was looking at life through eternity, through hope. That there is a more exceeding and there is a more eternal weight of glory that we work for in this life. It's not what we know it to be in this body, in this flesh and blood that we have. It's what we work for. Alma talks about it too, right? This is the time that we have to prepare for that eternal life that we have. And one of the ways that we can prepare for the eternal life that we can have is to be able to have a spiritual perception of life around us and how we can get through these situations. 23rd Psalm says, right? Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil. He doesn't say you stop in the shadow of death. Sometimes with our natural perception, we stop. We stop in the middle of the valley of death. And, that we get the consequences of that. But Paul's telling us, the writer in Psalms says, that we walk through the valley of the shadow of death. And although we physically have to succumb to that valley, if you will, it's our spiritual perception that gets us through it. And that's what I suggest that we need to try to work on as best as we can, that ability to get through those situations. Alma talks to his son Helaman here. He says in the 37th chapter of Alma, he says, "Behold, I say unto you that it's by small and simple things are great things brought to pass." And small means in many instances to found the wise. Little steps. You know, not the great grand deliverance that maybe we expect sometimes. We may have to go through the little steps. We may have to go through the surgery. We may have to go through the healing process, if you will, as some of you have, you know, to get through that whole situation. But it's by those little opportunities that we have, little steps, baby steps. We have babies running around all over here today. Baby steps. You know, just take those little steps with faith in the Lord, and we can see great things happen in their lives. You know, I guess the question we got to ask as we're going through a trial is how's this going to affect me tomorrow or in 5 years from now? And again, the question that we need to be thinking about, how's this going to affect me for eternity? You know, again, you know, the dues that I'm paying in this life, you know, are being collected for what we're going to get when we reap our reward after this life is done. That's what our hope is in the situation. But we're here now. We got little ones to take care of and obligations to deal with, responsibilities to employers and employees and husbands and wives and neighbors and friends and all that. We still got to stay occupied until that comes. And sometimes it gets overwhelming because it gets really depressing sometimes with what we see with our eyes and what we feel with our heart. You know, and what I'm suggesting again is that this invisible power that we have through God, you know, allows us to get past what we see, to see the hope of what there is, because we had faith that the Lord could get us through in this situation. Jesus taught us different things, you know, and with his examples on earth. He saw a tax collector in Matthew, right? Is that what he saw? Or did he see in Matthew a disciple? Someone that's going to take his word going forward. See, Jesus had a perception of a spirit that we really can't sometimes comprehend. You know, when Jesus came across the blind men, you know, did he see a blind man there? Or he saw the promise of being able to get him healed so he could see? You know, and he sees in you and me. He says, he sees something that's worth saving in us as we pledge our faith to him, as we dedicate our life to him, as we did in the waters of baptism. You know, I promised to serve the Lord all the days of my life. We all said that. You know, we all got dunked. We all came out as a new person.
Praise God.
And then life happens. And then what we see is sometimes not what we like or we expected. But from that immersion in the water to back up again, you know, we got a spiritual perception. You know, and we need to kind of re-energize that. We need to be reminded of that in our lives, that, you know, in God all things can be happening in a good way for us. Even though sometimes things aren't going so great, it's still pretty good. You know, no matter what, because we've got God in our life. A lot of times we just ask the question, why is this happening to me? Why am I going through this particular situation? Maybe a better question we could have is, what is God teaching me in this circumstance that I'm going through now? That's the difference in what we see versus spiritual perception. We're all going to go through stuff. From the day we're born to the day we die, stuff's going to happen. Unpredictable stuff. Unpleasant stuff. That go along with the blessings that we have in between all that. But, you know, Paul, in his wisdom and his experience, says to the Romans here, all things work together for good to them that love God and to them that are called according to his purpose. When we got dipped in the waters and came up again, we were called by God according to his purpose. And we're all very unique in our lives. Not only in the way we look, but the way we act, and the way we think, and the way we see things. But, one of the things that we could have in unity with one another is the way we see things through the singular eyes of God in our life. The message that we get from the Lord on our Sunday mornings and our fasting prayers and our Friday nights and our Thursday nights and the readings that we get from our scriptures and all that kind of stuff is the fact that, God's the same in our life. We just need to get on the same page with Him. He blesses us with individuality. We look different, we act different, we come from different backgrounds, nationalities and whatever it is. But collectively in our hearts we're one and the same. And that should get us to the perspective that we start to see things in the same way under God's eyes and all that. We need to remember what Nephi came across when he and his brothers were petitioned by Lehi to go back to Laban's house and secure the plates. And Laman and Lemuel, they kind of always saw things with their eyes. Nephi was able to see things with his heart and with the things of God. And as they failed the first 2 times to get there, they were just cowering in the corner about how are they going to do. Let's go home. Let's forget this idea about getting the plates. But Nephi knew that God said, this is what you got to do. And Nephi said to his brothers, there's nothing that God can set out to do for us that He won't prepare a way to let us get it done. That's spiritual perception. That's something that we can adopt in our life as well, that there's nothing that we can face in life, no challenge that we can face in life that God couldn't prepare us for to get through it. I go back to walking through that valley of shadow of death again. As Nephi saw himself, and what happened? He went in, he got the plates, and he fulfilled God's promises to what needed to be done to our benefit even to this day. What's God got in store for us? I don't know. But I know that with my own eyes, I'm never going to understand it. I'm always going to second guess what that motive is. But if I can kind of look at the plan of life from a spiritual perspective and just let God direct me, right? Trust in the Lord with all thine heart. You know the rest. That's spiritual perception. That gets us through things we don't understand. One of Jesus' most remarkable things when he was walking on this earth was his ability to heal a blind man's eyes so they can have eyesight again. I think even a more miraculous thing in our day is that he can heal our spiritual eyes. If we continue to give him our heart. If we allow ourselves to let him mold us and shape us and point him in the direction that he wants us to go. What Jesus can do for us, his example, he helps us to see hope instead of despair. That's spiritual perspective. We can see purpose and not confusion in the stuff that goes around us. Look at the news today. Every single bit of advice or information we get is more chaos, more confusion, more uncertainty, in terms we want to go. That's not God's way of allowing us to get through life. He sees there's a purpose to all things, right? Ecclesiastes says there's a time and purpose to all things, at all seasons, it says. That's God's idea of us being able to see life in His way, and in purpose in all kinds of things. Even the surgeries we have, even the heartache of death, even these things that just take us back. There's purpose in all that kind of stuff. When you have spiritual perception and a perspective of what goes on in our life. Ether says, actually it was written in Ether, and Jesus says here, he says, if men come unto me, I will show them their weakness. I give unto men weakness that they may be humbled. And my grace is sufficient for all men, that humble themselves before me. For if they humble themselves before me, then I will make weak things become strong unto them. Spiritual perception. Spiritual perception. Perspective. You know, God will take these chaotic moments in our times and sometimes circumstances in life force us to become humble. Does the scripture say again? The question is, well, why does a man need to be humble sometimes? Because, you know, we're looking at life through our natural eyes. We have all the answers. And what God's saying, you don't have the answers. You know, there are going to be things that are going to happen in your life that's going to compel you to be humble. And as you be compelled to be humble because you can't do it on your own, I'm going to make the weakness that you have in your life strong. And I'm going to give you answers to things in your life that you have no clue that you can handle or what's going to come. That's hope. That's promise. That's what God can do for us. He sees possibilities. We see limitations. So we need to kind of get ourselves back together again. Joshua and Caleb, they saw a land of milk and honey where the other guys couldn't see that at all. You know, Paul, in the midst of all his trials and tribulations and sufferings, you know, he saw glory instead of suffering. Nephi saw blessings instead of burdens and threats. Jesus, you know, he sees potential instead of imperfections in all of us. We need to kind of go back to that water again, coming back up out of that, refreshed with a new set of eyes that has a spiritual perspective on what's going on in our life. God can change our perspective. You know, He gives us that opportunity to do that in our life. So I hope this might give you some encouragement as we go out to this world tomorrow and it hits us smack in the face. And whatever's going to happen is going to happen. But because you have a spiritual perspective of life that God has given us, we can deal with it. We can handle it. We can bear a testimony that, you know what? It was bad this week, but you know what? I got through it. And I'm stronger because sometimes of the afflictions and sometimes the challenges and trials we get in our life, I'm stronger because God gave me a spiritual perspective of life. Okay. I'm done.
I enjoyed the words of our brother Walt today, and we're going to open it up here in just a moment to testimony. And if anyone has prayer requests as well and would like to be prayed for, added to the list, or anointed, we can certainly address those as well. I was thinking too today, this morning in fact, how God can see so much more than we can. And, you know, I really thought about it over the past day, like what would I have designed as my perfect life? And there are some things I would have changed, but would I really have been happier? And the Lord knows so much more than we do, so I enjoyed that message about perspective and perception today, and look forward to hearing from each of you on how the Lord is working in your lives. So we'll open it now for you to testify.